Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and right now it's Guilds of Ravnica Limited Review Week here on my channel. So far, this week, I've looked at every single card in Guilds of Ravnica that is monocolored and not green, and today we're continuing with green. If you want to know what the grades I give the cards in this video mean and how I come up with them, there's a link in the description below to a video where I explain all of that. Now, let's go ahead and look at our first green card, which is Affectionate Indrik, which for 5 generic and a green is a 4/4 beast at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So this is basically a 6-mana Necrotal. Okay, so I'm exaggerating a little, especially because it can only kill things and survive against creatures with 3 or less power and 4 or less toughness, so what it can kill will be somewhat limited. In a pinch, you can use it as an expensive removal spell to take down a 4/4 or whatever and get the 1-for-1, but obviously that isn't ideal. The high mana cost here also limits it a little. Still, it will have lots of situations where it can perform as a 2-for-1, and for that reason, I think you probably want one of these in most green decks. I don't think it's far-fetched to imagine scenarios where you play this and kill something like a 3/3 that your opponent has, and you have a 4/4 left behind that can reasonably trade with something else. I think that's going to happen a lot with this card, and if that's the case, even at 6 mana, I think you first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Arboretum Elemental, which for 7 generic and 2 green is a 7/5 elemental at uncommon. It has Convoke. That's the first time in this video we're seeing that mechanic, so I'll give you the reminder text, which says, your creatures can help cast this spell. Each creature you tap while casting this spell pays for 1 or more mana of that creature's color. It also has hexproof, because why not? Let's put it on uncommon some more. We've had a lot of fun with that lately, haven't we? At least this one costs 9 mana, and yeah, it has Convoke, but even then, your opponent is really going to take a while to get this monster down. That said, once they do so, it isn't going to be very much fun to try and stop it. It has low toughness, so you can definitely double block it to take it down, but if your ideal scenario is 2-for-1ing yourself, that's not going to be so good, and you better hope your opponent doesn't have auras and the like to put on this. I think it is overall a nice payoff for a deck that can really go wide, which is generally going to be the green-white Selesnya deck, but I don't think it's incredible. I think it asks you to try hard to make it come into play, and I think that's a good place to put hexproof instead of just putting it on like a 4-drop or something. I think it's a solid C. Next, we have Beast Whisperer, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 2/3 Elf Druid at rare, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card. You know me, I like drawing cards, and Beast Whisperer helps me out with that. A 4-mana 2/3 is pretty bad stats-wise, but as soon as you draw even a single card off of this, you're coming out ahead. Once you draw more than that, you're really doing it, and you're just going to grind out the win. And it isn't asking you to do something crazy to draw cards, by the way. It's asking you to play something that most limited decks have at least 15 of without even trying: creatures. Yeah, I'm on board with this guy. Will it hurt if you play this and each removal right away? Sure, but hey, that's still a 1-for-1, and things could go way worse. I think he's worth that risk, and I'm going to be first picking him pretty happily. I think he's a nice solid B. Next, we have Bounty of Might, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a rare instant that says target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. The video's not skipping, it says that 3 separate times. This is a powerful but expensive combat trick. Obviously, being an instant, it may represent 9 damage out of nowhere for you to win the game. It can also create 3-for-1s without a whole lot of effort, and those always shift things in your favor. Additionally, unlike most combat tricks, this one doesn't suffer as much from the problem of getting 2-for-1. This is partly because it is so strong that it is worth the risk, but this is also because even if they do kill one of the creatures, your other 2 are still going to get huge. I don't normally find myself liking combat tricks, especially those that cost 6, but this one is both resilient and powerful, so I think it's worth it. I even think it's worth first picking in some packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Circuitous Route, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and or gate cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. This is good. Explosive Vegetation's already a pretty good limited card if ramp is a legitimate strategy, but this is an upgrade since it can also get Guild Gates. This is the kind of card that really enables 4 or 5 color strategies, as well as the gate heavy deck, which has a little bit of support. If you take this pack 1 pick 1, you are setting yourself up nicely for mana, and I think it is a solid choice to take pack 1 pick 1. It is good enough even without gates, though obviously the gates make it far better. Ramping and fixing like this are hard to come by in limited, and this does super well. I don't think you take it over premium removal or bombs, but I think you take it over just about anything else because it enables one of the most powerful draft strategies there are, which is I'm just going to take whatever the best card is, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Crushing Canopy, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says choose 1, destroy target creature with flying, destroy target enchantment. We've seen this a lot, and it is always a nice sideboard card since it gives you answers to both lots of flyers and lots of enchantments. The fact it can target both also makes it playable if you're desperate and you need a 23rd card. I think it's like a D main board, but you really want to be playing it out of your sideboard where it's like a C+. Next, we have Devkarin Dissident, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf warrior, and it has an activated ability. You can pay 4 generic and a green, and it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. 2 mana 2/2s are nothing special these days, and they have to do something awesome to get out of like the D+, C- area, and this doesn't really do that. Sure, it has a decent mana sink ability, but 5 to pump it, +2/+2 isn't exactly a good deal. It does mean that if you have nothing else to do with your mana, you can threaten that she'll get bigger, and that's nice, but I think she's still a C-. Next, we have District Guide, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf scouted uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land or a gate card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. I'm old enough to have drafted OG Ravnica, and in that set we had Civic Wayfinder, which was basically this card, except it was common and it couldn't grab gates. Gates didn't actually exist in original Ravnica anyway. It was an incredible source of fixing in a format where you want fixing really bad, and as a result it was a pretty high pick. I think District Guide continues that tradition, and being able to get gates actually makes it considerably better than the Wayfinder was. This is the best source of fixing in the set, basically, and as a result, I think you feel fine about snatching this up with the first pick. I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Generous Stray, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/2 cat at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. I always like creatures to draw me a card because they can represent a 2-for-1, but I'm not super thrilled about this one. Paying 1 more mana for an Elvish Visionary and getting 1 more toughness doesn't seem like a big enough upgrade to me. I'd rather just have Elvish Visionary. That said, it isn't bad, just easy to replace and certainly not impressive. I think it's a C-. There are a few cards in black, especially, that like to sacrifice stuff, and in that deck it does get a little bit better, but not enough really for it to get a build around grade. I think it's just a C-. Next, we have Golgari Raiders, which for 3 generic and a green is a 0/0 elf warrior at uncommon. It has haste, and when it enters the battlefield, it has Undergrowth, which is an ability that checks how many cards, creature cards that is, are in your graveyard. And in this case, it gets +1/+1 counters on it for each creature card in your graveyard. It's an interesting payoff for loading up your graveyard. Problem is, it is pretty terrible in your average limited deck, where playing it on turn 4 probably nets you like a 1/1 with haste. In a deck that has Surveil and other ways to mill itself, it does get better, but how much better, really? I think even in those decks, you aren't going to do a very good job of playing this as an efficient creature on turn 4. What's worse is its stats are not directly tied to your graveyard. They don't go up and down as creatures enter or leave it. It only checks when it comes into play. As a result, you really have to have things set up nicely for this card to work, otherwise it's pretty bad. I have a hard time envisioning any deck where this will be great, or good even. I think Golgari decks can probably make it have a big stats in the mid to late game, so I suppose it isn't entirely unplayable, but I'm not impressed. I'm giving it a D. Next, we have Grappling Sundew, which for 1 generic and a green is a plant at uncommon. It's a 0/4. It has Defender, it has Reach, and you can pay 4 generic and a green to give it indestructible until end of turn. I'm not impressed here. 5 mana for indestructibility granted to your 0/4 creature isn't really worth it in most scenarios. Leaving that mana up will basically never happen until the late game, and sure, when it can just keep blocking your opponent's biggest creature, whether it has flying or not, it's not too bad. Early, it blocks most creatures reasonably well too, but neither of those things is great. You need to find a way to win the game. You need to draw a card that's impactful, not one that just stalls. All it does is block, and it can't kill anything because it has 0 power, so I'm not overly enthused about this. If you're a super defensive green deck, maybe it goes up. I don't know. I'm starting it at a D. Next, we have Hatchery Spider, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 5/7 spider with reach. It's rare, and it has the Undergrowth mechanic. In this case, you reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. You may put a green permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I like this card a lot. A 7 mana 5/7 with reach is admittedly underwhelming, but its Undergrowth ability has serious potential. I think on turn 7, without even milling yourself at all, it won't be that difficult to have like 3 creatures in your graveyard, and hitting a card off of this is probable. It is important, by the way. It only lets you play a green permanent, and that limits its power in limited somewhat, since about half your permanents are likely to not be green. Still, you're going to hit a decent percentage of the time, and then when you get into actually milling yourself, it can do some awesome things. Still, as much as I'm excited to cast this card, the limitation to only green permanents hurts it, especially when it is already asking you for some help by loading up the graveyard. As a result, I am going to reluctantly give it a C+, but you probably always play it in green. Splashing it in your Deemer decks won't really work, sadly, because of the fact that it only gets green cards, and that's really disappointing. That's like one thing that could have changed. Sure, it has 2 green, so it's hard to splash anyway, but whatever. It's a C+. Next, we have Hitchclaw Recluse, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 spider with reach at common. Another reprint, this spider can block the majority of flyers in the format and can even kill some of them, but kind of like the wall we looked at a few cards ago. That's basically all it does, and I think it's another D. Though I guess it's worth noting that as a mentor, it could get kind of interesting as a creature that gets mentored, a mentee, if you will. Next, we have Iron Shell Beetle, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 insect at common, and when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We've seen this card before, and it was pretty nice. The flexibility it offers is appealing. On turn 2, if you have nothing else, it's a 2-mana 2/2. Nothing great, but certainly fine. Later in the game, when a 2-mana 2/2 isn't going to change much, it can be used to make one of your evasive creatures bigger, or pump one of your creatures so that it has more profitable attacks. This will also work well with creatures with Mentor. It's a solid 2-drop for green, and I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Crawl Foragers, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/4 insect scout at common. It has Undergrowth. You gain 1 life for each creature card in your graveyard when it enters the battlefield. This is nothing special. It's sort of a classic definition of filler. A 5-mana 4/4 is like a D+ or so, and adding the Undergrowth ability definitely improves that grade, but not drastically. It will gain you 2 or 3 life without a lot of effort, and probably like 5 in decks that are really looking at loading the graveyard. But you'd rather have almost any of the other Undergrowth payoffs, and as a result, I think you play this, but you're not like excited about it. I think it's just a C. Next, we have Crawl Harpooner, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/2 insect warrior at uncommon. It has reach, and it has Undergrowth. In its case, when it enters the battlefield, you choose up to 1 target creature with flying you don't control. Crawl Harpooner gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Then you may have Crawl Harpooner fight that creature. This is a cool card. A 2-mana 3/2 with reach is pretty nice, just because the stats are so good, and adding reach means it can have more late game viability than most 2-drops. It gets additional late game viability too, by being able to harpoon a flying creature right out of the sky. Even on its own, it will essentially function as Plummet, and it isn't going to be impossible to take down even bigger creatures. And the later the game goes on, it becomes even more like Plummet. This is an awesome card to be in your deck because it's essentially a split card. The creature on one side, Plummet on the other. It is some pretty nice flexibility. There are enough flying creatures around that I think this gets pretty close to being worth taking with your first pick, though this is the kind of card that could go up or down depending on how many of the flyers are heavily played in this format. I'm going to shy away from saying you want to take it with the first pick, though. I don't think I will be when this format starts, and I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Might of the Masses, which for 1 green is an uncommon instant, and target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature you control. Another reprint. This is a nice trick for decks that are going wide, and as a result, it will be at most at home in Selesnya decks. If you're getting +2/+2 out of this, you're doing a good job. Anything more than that, and it starts to get very strong. That said, it is a trick that relies on you having a decent board state, and it has all the downsides tricks usually have. You can get 2 for 1. You at least don't take quite as much of a hit as you would with some other tricks because it only costs 1 mana. A trick has to be super impressive for me to want to give it more than a C, and to me, a C is pretty good for a trick, basically indicating you always play the first copy of the card in your green decks, and that's what this gets, a C. Next, we have Nullhide Ferox, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 beast at Mythic Rare with hexproof. Also says you can't cast non-creature spells. You can also pay 2 generic mana, and actually, so can your opponent. Nullhide Ferox loses all abilities until end of turn. Any player may activate this ability. And, just to add on to this huge text box, if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Nullhide Ferox, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. This is an interesting one. I like the way they designed hexproof here since you can just turn it off. On the flip side, you can turn off the fact that he doesn't let you cast creature spells, too. On top of all that, you can play it for free if your opponent makes you discard it, but that won't come up that often in Limited. In general, this card has a neat design that really makes you and your opponent enter into sort of a mini-game. Your opponent has to pay 2 extra for any removal spell to kill it, which is a pretty steep tax. In a pinch, you can remove its abilities so that you can play that all-important removal spell, but you're putting your Nullhide Ferox at risk. I would say, though, you should only do that if your opponent doesn't have a way to interact with the Ferox. Then you don't have to put it at risk. Overall, I think this card is very good. Obviously, it destroys the vanilla test as a 4-mana 6/6 with hexproof. And to be honest, the downside it comes with, that you can, again, turn off when you need to, isn't that big of a downside. Creatures are going to be more plentiful in your deck than anything, so it is only making it so you can't cast a few cards in your deck. It will be tough for opponents to take him down in the early going, like if you drop him on turn 4, the number of removal spells that can take this guy down, especially when you add 2 to their cost, is very limited, and he will end a lot of games when he comes down early. Obviously, even late, he has stats that have to be reckoned with. Does this get into the A range, signifying it's an absolute bomb? I think it's just short, even though if you drop it on turn 4, it will feel like an A card. I'm going to be starting it at B+. I mean, that still means it's better than the vast majority of cards in this format, and there will be very, very rare circumstances when it's not the card you take with the first pick. Next, we have Pax Favor, which for 2 generic and a green is an instant at common. It has Convoke, and target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Combat tricks with Convoke are always fun, as sometimes they present even more of a surprise element. If your opponent looks over and sees you tapped out, they may forget to think about the possibility that you have this and block in a way where you can really destroy them. Don't be that person, though. Keep this card in mind when you're playing. If your opponent's tapped out, they may have this in their hand. Now that I said that, I'm definitely going to forget about this at some point in one of my draft videos, but hey, do as I say, not as I do. Anyway, this is an alright trick. You never really want to pay 3 or 4 for it, but 2 or less is nice. You'll play it in some green decks, but I think it's also kind of easy to cut. I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Pause for Reflection, which for 2 generic and a green is an instant at common. It has Convoke, and it says, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Fogs are bad in Limited. They don't do anything in 99% of scenarios. You are basically mulliganing if this is in your hand. I don't care if you add Convoke. Although, like with the combat trick we just looked at, people might forget you can do this and Alpha Strike in a dangerous way if you're tapped out. But you can't count on your opponent forgetting this card exists, because that's basically the only scenario where it does anything, and as a result, it's an F. Next, we have Pelt Collector, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 Elf Warrior at rare. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, if that creature's power is greater than Pelt Collector's, put a +1/+1 counter on Pelt Collector. As long as Pelt Collector has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it has Trample. I like this card, and it takes a lot for me to say that about most 1-drops in Limited. This one is obviously a good one because unlike most 1-drops, which quickly get outclassed, this one grows as your other creatures get progressively larger and even gets a bonus when they die, and gets Trample once he gets buff enough. Adding the whole dies clause to it is no small thing, as it gives it a lot more utility in the late game than it would have if it just said when a bigger creature enters the battlefield. And I think that is central to making this card go from being like merely alright to being a good card, and probably the ideal card to play on turn 1 in this format. I think the sheer power of it on turn 1, coupled with the relevance of it in the late game, makes this 1-drop pretty great, even worth first picking. I'm giving it a B-. Next we have Portcullis Vine, which for 1 green mana is a 0/3 plant wall at common. It has Defender. You can pay 2 and sacrifice a creature with Defender to draw a card. This is kind of weird. There are an unusually high number of Defenders in this set, but this is the only payoff around. It's not a bad one. Even on its own, it represents a decent early blocker that, once it becomes irrelevant, can cash itself in. I think that's the best way to use this. I wouldn't go after the other Defenders just because you have this. Most of them aren't that good. It isn't going to be worth it in most cases. This just barely gets into the C range for me at C-. Next, we have Prey Upon, which for 1 green mana is a common sorcery, and it says target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. A green removal spell we see all the time. Prey Upon is always solid. Obviously, you need to have a reasonable number of creatures with 3 power or higher to want to play this, and you need to always be careful to use it when your opponent can't interact with you, but it's a fine removal spell for green decks. The fact that it asks for you to do a few things first keeps it from being close to premium removal, but I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Siege Worm, which for 5 generic and 2 green mana is a 5/5 worm at common with Convoke and Trample. Last time we saw this, in original Ravnica, it was a nice common for green. Playing it on turn 5 thanks to Convoke and or Ramp isn't all that hard to do, and a 5/5 Trampler on turn 5 is nice, and sometimes you can play it even sooner. I think most green decks will want one of these at the top of their curve. I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Sprouting Renewal, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It has Convoke, and it's a modal card. You choose one of 2 options. One is create a 2/2 green and white Elf Knight creature token with Vigilance, and the other is Naturalize, destroy target artifact or enchantment. This is pretty nice. Neither mode on this is getting done efficiently, at least without Convoke. With Convoke, they can actually be reasonably efficient. Either way, both modes can be useful. Making creature tokens is what Selesnya is about, and being able to blow up a problem artifact or enchantment is also pretty nice. I think you always play this in green. It is nice being able to play a mainboard Naturalize effect, who can be something else without a target. But I don't think you want this early at all. I think it's another C+. Next, we have Urban Utopia, which for 1 generic and a green is a common aura. It's an enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. An enchanted land has add 1 mana of any color. Tap for that effect, obviously. This is a Ravnica set, and if it's like the ones of the past, being able to play multiple colors is powerful. We haven't gotten to them yet, but we will start seeing them tomorrow. There are lots of powerful multicolored cards around. This helps you splash those colors while also replacing itself. It's a great way to fix your mana, though I don't think it's quite reaches the level of the 2 uncommons that can search up guild gates, but it's pretty good. I think it's another C+. Next, we have Vigor Spore Worm, which for 5 generic and a green is a 6/4 worm at common. It has Undergrowth. When it enters the battlefield, target creature gains Vigilance and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Vigor Spore Worm can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. This is a nice worm. 6 for a 6/4 isn't exactly ideal, but only being able to be blocked by 1 creature and having that body would probably be something like a D or D+. Its Undergrowth ability is where the real value is, though. Even if you just get to pump something +1/+1 and give it Vigilance, which is really easy to pull off, you're getting good value out of this card. If your deck is really adept at loading the graveyard, it could create some pretty frightening attackers, especially if they have some evasive ability. This is the kind of green card that I think in an ideal world, you want one of in every green deck, but I don't think you should go after it super early. I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Vivid Revival, which for 4 generic and a green is a rare sorcery, and you return up to 3 target multicolored cards from your graveyard to your hand, and then you exile Vivid Revival. This is an interesting card. 5 mana to draw 3 gold cards from your graveyard is a good deal. Problem is, this is asking you to do too much for most limited decks. You need to stock your graveyard well first, and you need to have a lot of multicolored cards. I know what you're thinking. This is Ravnica, of course I will have multicolored cards. And you're right, they are more plentiful than usual, but still, you need like 7 to make this decent and probably 10 to make it the kind of card you always want to play. If you aren't getting the 3 cards back and are getting 2 or 1, it's pretty inefficient overall. I think this is just an F in your typical limited deck in this format, but I do think it has a high ceiling. If you manage some sort of base green 5-color monstrosity loaded with gold cards, this seems like a lot of fun to me. I hope I get to do that at some point. If you manage to make that kind of deck work, which I think is going to be possible, if not probable, then it's probably a B. Next, we have Wary Okapi, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 Antelope at common with Vigilance. Here is the obligatory French vanilla common green card that isn't very exciting, but is perfectly playable. In other words, this has decent stats and an okay keyword ability. I think you play it in a lot of scenarios, but it's probably also one of the first cards you cut when trying to get down to 23 or 24, giving it a C-. Next, our final card in green is Wild Ceratok, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 Rhino at common. 4 mana 4/3s always end up playing reasonably well in limited, as boring as they are. I think it's a C. Well, that's the last monocolored card in Guilds of Ravnica for us to look at. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you have any disagreements with me, you can let me know about them in the comments below. Tomorrow, we finally start getting into the multicolored cards, which is going to be divided into 2 videos because there's so many of them. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at the Deemer, Selesnya, and Izzet cards. If you want to make sure you catch that video and all the rest of my videos, including Guilds of Ravnica sealed and draft videos, which will soon be coming, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.